Hello everyone! Welcome back to science class. Today we're going to be talking about ecosystem dynamics. This will be the last topic in our ecology section. So ecosystem dynamics involves the movement and transportation of matter and energy throughout an ecosystem. So we've talked about trophic relationships already, so let's just do a review of that. A trophic relationship is essentially a food chain. It transports matter and energy through the organisms throughout the food chain. The producers are the ones that make their own energy from the energy of the sun, and then they grow and feed consumers. Now, primary consumers will feed on plants, which are the producers, and then secondary consumers will feed on the primary consumers, etc., until you reach the top level. Now, when everything dies, they have to be decomposed. Decomposers will take the material that was used in each of those producers and consumers, turn it back into nutrients, which then goes back into the environment. So let's focus on matter for a moment. The universal law of conservation of mass states that the amount of matter in the universe is constant. You cannot create nor destroy matter. And we can see that when we look at the food cycles, the food chains. Producers feed off of the sun, and they feed off of the nutrients in the water and the soil. They grow, and then they get eaten by consumers. And then those consumers get eaten in turn. So we all eat food, and we all grow. Some of us are growing up, some of us are growing out. But we all grow. Eventually, we will all die. And then that matter gets processed and decomposed by things like mushrooms and bacteria. And they turn the organic matter, like sugars, fats, and proteins, they turn it back into the very simple chemical molecules, the inorganic chemical molecules that the soil has. And that way the new plants, the new producers, can take that and make new food. So all of this boils down to basically a word that we use called chemical recycling. And chemical recycling is just the process where inorganic materials turn to organic materials, and then they turn back into the inorganic materials. So last video, I mentioned this word chemical recycling when I was talking about decomposers. That's because decomposers are a really important part of it. But producers are also a really important part of it too. Because without producers, you wouldn't have that kind of starting of the cycle. So producers essentially start the cycle where they take the inorganic material, turn it into organic material, and then the decomposers do the finishing where they take the organic material and turn it into the simple inorganic molecules. So I want to talk about energy now. You see, unlike matter, energy doesn't get recycled in the food chain. Matter does because we have a limited amount on the planet Earth. But our energy doesn't come from Earth. It actually comes from the sun. Without the sun, there would be no life. And we've seen that on other planets and stuff. Obviously, having more than just the sun is required for life. Like we need water, and we need all the special chemicals that we need, like oxygen, nitrogen, like carbon. We need all those things. But the sun is very, very, very important because the sun is what kickstarts all of the energy that travels through the food chains. So if we think about it, the energy from the sun comes down and feeds the plants, the producers. They combine the sun energy with the nutrients in the water, and then they make their own energy. Now, they make their own energy so that they can grow, and that requires a cost. So the energy that they take in doesn't mean that all of that energy stays within the plant. Plants actually give off heat, just like we do. And that is a byproduct of growing, essentially. So, when a rabbit would go to eat some grass, the rabbit is not getting all of the energy from the sun. They're only getting a certain amount of energy from the grass that is not used for growing. When the snake goes to eat the rabbit, the snake is not getting all of the energy from the grass because the rabbit needs some energy to grow as well. So as you move up the food chain, there is less and less energy being transferred. Everything uses energy, and everything loses energy through heat. So the top predator, like the hawk or the wolf, needs to eat a lot of food in order to be able to have just the basic bodily functions, compared to a rabbit that only eats grass. So let's just summarize for a bit. The sun feeds the plants feed the first primary producers, like the rabbits. Those feed the secondary consumers, and then the secondary consumers feed the top predators. The plants take in a lot of energy from the sun. The primary consumers only eat about 10% of the energy from the grass. And then the secondary consumers only eat about 10% of the energy from the primary consumers. And then the top predator only eats about 10% of the energy from the secondary consumers. Kind of confusing, I know. But what I want you to remember is that at every level, you lose energy. And you need to have that constant flow of energy from the sun in order to sustain life in general. So, one of the last topics that I want to talk about in the broader topic of ecosystems are disturbances. There are two kinds of disturbances that happen in an ecosystem. There are natural disturbances and there are human disturbances. So a natural disturbance would be something like a tornado, an earthquake, a rock slide, a volcanic eruption, things like that. A disturbance essentially means that the ecosystem changes dramatically due to some kind of disturbance. So, for instance, an earthquake would rupture the earth, cause some trees to fall down, maybe even cause a rock slide or two. A volcanic eruption would probably destroy the countryside because it would burn away all of the plants and animals that live there. A tsunami could cause massive flooding. And those are all things that happen on a regular day-to-day basis. They may not happen every day, but it's not uncommon. It's perfectly normal for them to happen. When we talk about human disturbances, this is where the environment is disturbed by our actions. So, for instance, building a building disturbs the ecosystem. We get rid of a bunch of plants and animals, and we build concrete structures, or wood structures, or steel structures. And by building these buildings, we prevent the plants in that area from being able to grow. Another example of a human disturbance would be war. War is super destructive. It not only hurts a lot of people and causes the dislocation of millions and millions of refugees. I don't know if dislocation was the correct terminology to use. Well, let's go with that. But war also really hurts the environment. Think of all the explosives. Think of the atomic bombs in like Hiroshima. Those have affected the environment in really dramatic ways, and it has taken a long time for the environment to kind of recover. Now, talking about recovery, if you look where I'm standing in one of the buildings on the old site, and you can see that there are plants growing through the concrete. They've found their way through cracks in the concrete, and they're growing. They're going to eventually retake this area because it's not being maintained by people. Now, the environment will always respond to a disturbance. They start off by growing small plants again. Those smaller plants grow into bushes. Those bushes grow eventually into small trees. And then finally, the small trees would grow into the bigger tall trees. Now, of course, this is talking about like a forested area. Desert and ocean ecosystems are very different. But if you think about that, that is a succession. Gradual, smaller plants eventually taking over by bigger plants. It's restoring balance to the ecosystem, and that is called ecological succession. That is all for the topic of ecosystems. That is all for the topic of ecology. I hope you enjoyed this journey, and I look forward to seeing you next when we start talking about atoms and molecules.